In ancient times, writers wrote rhetorically. That is to say, they wrote in a very intentional manner and wanted to persuade the readers of something. There was an intention to get you to think a certain way, to learn a truth, to form a thought or an attitude. They weren't what we demand of our modern day reporters, giving us facts that we can't argue with. But let's face it, our modern day reporters don't really do that for us as well. And often, if we're to be honest, it's not really what we want from them either, though we claim we do. The truth is, we all like to have our own ideas and preconceived notions reinforced. It's very gratifying to feel right all of the time. So many of us pick our news stations and newspapers because we like what they say, rather than because what they say challenges us to new growth. There isn't much growth in hearing the same things over and over again to only hearing one side, and especially when that side only backs up the way that you already feel. You don't get to open yourselves up to how other people in God's creation might hear the same things or conceive of the same ideas. And so we have the writing, the recording, if you will, of Mark. Though I hate to call it that at all, because that's not necessarily what Mark is doing while he's writing. We know a few things about the writer of the Gospel of Mark. One of which is that it is pretty much an accepted thing in Bible studies with every biblical scholar in the world, really, that Mark was the first of the Gospels written. Though we don't go into the details of them today, or we won't, there is a ton of other distinctive qualities to this book of Mark. A close study of Mark with some research and some analytical practices would show you how some of these things you might come to believe about Mark would tell you what he was trying to convince people of. Of course, you might see it differently than someone else, but if you were to read Mark very closely, not have it read to you, but to read it yourself, and then go through some step-by-step processes, maybe comparing it to other ancient documents, maybe comparing it up against the other Gospels, considering the issues of the times, seeing what Mark repeats or what patterns are in there, it would tell you what that writer was actually trying to tell you about Jesus. But what is interesting to me is this. Mark's story about Jesus doesn't begin with Jesus. It begins with John. In fact, we just heard the beginning of the good news about Jesus is John. John the Baptist. John the wild man. The locust and honey-eaten, camel-wearing John. The dude who would unnerve the ruling class so much in his ministry by calling out their immoral behavior that his head would end up on a platter. John is the beginning of the story of Jesus according to Mark, who is the first gospel ever written. This man had his own group of following disciples. He was no joke. He was a significant person in his faith, whether you liked him or not. Even when Jesus gathered his own disciples, people didn't leave John to go to Jesus. There's good evidence that they stayed with John and traveled around with him. Not to work against Jesus, but likely working in concert with him, much like what we might do in our modern world today. There's a lot we don't know about John and how John and Jesus worked together. Most of that we'll never know, but we can only speculate based on what we do read. Here are a few things we're told about John. In Luke, where the birth narrative of Jesus is told, and in fact, actually, Luke is the only gospel that goes into the nativity story the way we traditionally speak of it on Christmas Eve. We also have the story of the birth of John. So one might think the writer of Luke is very concerned with how both Jesus and John came into the world. Mark doesn't mention Jesus' birth at all. So Luke is focused on these things and writes about them. And John's birth and his conception, just like Jesus, is a pretty miraculous event in itself. We are also told of the reaction of John and Jesus that they had to each other while they were still in their mother's womb. It's said that John leap inside Elizabeth's womb at the presence of Jesus coming close to him. Luke tells us that they are very connected spirits. In fact, all the Gospels would say that about John and Jesus. That together they knew they were in something together and they were connected to each other. John is even the one who identifies that the Spirit of God was descending like a dove in one version of the baptism of Jesus. He's the one that sees it, and he's the one that first tells people Jesus is the Son of God. Whenever John is talked about in the Gospels, he is lifted up and then almost immediately put back down. He shows up so very important and talked about as if he is important and significant like we know. And then his character is slightly pushed down in order to make Jesus even more glorious. It happens in all of the stories of John. Anytime he shows up, they say really great things, but then it's like, well, he's not as good as Jesus. Every single time. Which is true. In verses 7 and 8 today, after a pretty cool description of John, at least in my eyes, we're told that he himself proclaimed, "The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me." John the Baptist, with all these gathering people, all these people who came to the River Jordan to be baptized by him, said of Jesus, "I am not worthy to even stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals." That's really saying something. When the writer put that in there, they wanted you to know that as important as John is, Jesus is so much more. And John knew that and had no problems with it. There's never an episode of animosity between John's ministry and Jesus. In fact, John knows that his sole purpose is to be the one telling that Jesus is coming. And he's okay with that. In verse 8, he says, "I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." John is great, but not as great as the one coming after him. John is also written about in this gospel as prophets foretold of his coming as well, just as Jesus is written about. In verse 2 and 3 today, we heard, "As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, 'See, I am coming. I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight.'" In this part of Isaiah, they're not proclaiming that Jesus is coming. They're proclaiming that John is coming ahead of Jesus. That's a big deal. Thousands of years before you came into existence, prophets are talking about you coming because God has told them that you will. John's a big deal, but not as big as Jesus. What John had to share was not only the truth, but was what we might say in our world today, real news. Something different, something new, something concrete, something real was about to happen. He wasn't someone on a street corner telling us that the world would end today, though we see no signs of that. He was telling us not that the world was about to end, but that something was about to begin. Something bigger and something better than even his ministry was coming. John was really pretty cool stuff. Kids today might say that John was goals. I think I'm saying that right. Am I saying that right, Mary? John is goals. John is goals, right? Jesus is, if you have goals, Jesus is above goals, okay? Something we can't even comprehend. And he was right. There's no way we can come into a full understanding of Jesus. That's okay. Even though some might debate it, others, or plenty of people debate, believe it or not, whether or not the resurrection actually occurred. There are Christians even who don't believe that the resurrection of Jesus occurred. I, for one, do, and I have lots of information to back that up, as I'm sure most of you do as well. But we can sit and study whether or not that occurred, but the reality of it is they can tear apart the Gospels or look at different things and criticize them and say, well, see here, maybe it didn't happen this way. But here's what we know if we look at another part of the Bible. In the rest of the New Testament, in Paul's letters, Soon after Jesus' death and resurrection, Paul was already writing to churches in places like Ephesus, which was a very significant city, and Rome. He wasn't writing to the church in Rome. He was trying to get to the churches in Rome. This message that John was proclaiming, that Jesus brought, was so powerful that in ancient times, without Facebook booths or event pages or newspapers or even print, without any of that to spread the word, within just a few years of his death, there were churches set up all over the place of believers celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That doesn't happen unless people knew it happened. From Rome to Ephesus to Jerusalem, the word has spread. On foot, by horse, however it might have gotten there. And not only that, people were taking the time to write down things about this and pass them on. Not in a place where you enter the code into the copier and make 10 copies. In a time and place where people had to write word for word everything over again on animal skin from ink made out of things that are not easy to come by. This meant something to people. It was and is a real thing. People don't do that for things that are just myths or stories. So how does this relate to us today? What does this mean for us? Sure, so people thousands of years ago saw the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and began a new way of life with it. But what about us, sometimes who feel so far removed from that? Here's what I would say. We already know, as we talk about a lot, I tend to toot the horn of this church often, that what we have going on here is a great thing. We've all heard the numbers of how we've grown. Well, this week we seem to be a little down, but that's all right. We know that in 2 years we've taken in 30 new members. In a church this size, that is truly a miracle. It is absolutely unheard of in our times. We know that we've doubled in attendance in 2 years. We know that our giving has doubled. We know that we do things now like we've never done before, while still honoring all the great that we've done before. So yeah, we have a good thing going on here. People in our community are recognizing things about us and even adjusting their churches to it, or asking us or some of our lay leaders for advice. We're doing a good thing. We're spreading the message. But here's the truth, my friends. Jesus is still coming over and over again each day into our lives. What we have here is great. The message we are sharing is really cool. I would say we're goals. But what we have in our future as a faith community, what we have in store for the world, what the whole world has in store if they become more open to the coming of Jesus again, each day in our hearts. Trust me, as Jesus continues to be arriving, the things that we can do, we can't even comprehend. We've had a good year in this church, a really good year in this church. But I believe without a doubt that if we allow Jesus to continue to come into our faith, into our community, into our church, that we can't even comprehend even what 2018 will bring, much less 2028. I pay attention to things in the church world, maybe more than others do, hopefully more than most of you do, because that's my job. I see the trends, I know what's going on around us, not just here in our area, but around the world and in our country with churches like ours. It doesn't look like a good story, but I know that Jesus is working. I know this is a Jesus that dies on a cross, a painful death, and comes back in a glorious life. And I believe our churches will do the same. Maybe not in the same form as they ever were before, but they will. While churches around us dwindle and die, we're growing and reaching new people in ways that they don't know how to do. Even when they were to try what we're doing, it wouldn't quite work for them because they're in a different place. I know that Jesus comes here every time we gather. I know that we can't even comprehend what will come in the future. I know that our message is not fake news. I know that something is coming bigger than we can imagine. Honestly, who among us 2 years ago thought we would be here today? I know of people even in our church denomination that 4 or 5 years ago would have thought this church would have been closed by now. And if they had taken only the evidence of what they saw then, they were making a fair assessment. Because that's what happens in a lot of places. But what they didn't predict was that we would allow Jesus to show up again in our lives in a new way. Not that Jesus had disappeared from here, but that we would allow new things and new forms of Jesus' Spirit in our lives. What we have here today is awesome. But the truth is that I believe, as great and glorious as we feel about what we have now, is not worthy of even tying the sandals of the future that we will see in the years to come. And that, my friends, is not fake news. Amen. Please.